Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you may be. Welcome to today's special event brought to you by the UBS Center for Economics in Society. Now, many of us have been brought up on the adage of never mix pleasure with work, and we shall blatantly ignore that idea today and turn our attentions to what, in the eyes of many and in the immortal words of Brazilian soccer player Pelé, is known as the beautiful game. Now, the beautiful game took a decided turn towards what many considered ugliness in April of this year, when plans for a European Super League were announced, which would have involved 12 clubs monopolizing their positions forever in exchange for vast sums of money, and an unprecedented outcry by fans, politicians, journalists meant that within 3 days, these plans were shelved. Now, we take our mission seriously at the UBS Center for Economics and Society. We try to think about the things that society cares about from a decidedly economics point of view. And here today with us to help with that structured process of thinking, two superstars of economics, Ignacio Palacios-Huerta from the LSE and author of Beautiful Game Theory, How Soccer Can Help Economics, Szymanski, who is the Galetti Professor of Sport Management at the University of Michigan, and the author of Soccernomics, Why England Loses, Why Germany and Brazil Win. And we will start off with Ignacio. You have about 10 to 15 minutes for an introductory statement. Then Stefan will take over. And then we will let the two of you chat a little bit before we open it up to the public. And it should appear now or very soon a link to a website by Mentimetrics, where you can actually enter a code and then send questions to us, which I will then relay to our today's participants. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Ignacio. Take it away.
All right. Thank you very much for your invitation, Joachim, and thank you to the UBS Center and to the University of Zurich. It is indeed my pleasure to be here with you today. In these introductory statements, I would like to make just 3 basic points before we engage in a deeper conversation and exchange our ideas. The first one is that when we see events, social events, as important as those we have seen the last few weeks, the last month around the European Super League, I think it's important to step back a little bit and try to gain a deeper perspective and understanding of, in some sense, what is football or soccer all about. I remember writing in the first chapter of a book that I wrote a few years ago, Beautiful Game Theory, a nice paragraph from a guy called Enrique Gonzalez, who is a very insightful writer and journalist. Now he's a correspondent for El País in Buenos Aires. So let me read this for you. He wrote, the industrialization of the 19th century bequeathed to the 20th century two mass phenomena that are oddly intertwined, Marxism and soccer. Both were born out of the migration from rural areas to the city, the crisis of the divine, and the alienation of the new proletariat. Marxists proposed the socialization of the means of production and the hegemony of the working class as a solution. Soccer, on the other hand, proposed one ball, 11 players, and one flag. I really like that paragraph. I mean, in some sense, now, 1 century later, there is no doubt about which proposal was more attractive to people. In my view, of the 3 ingredients that soccer or football offers, the most essential one to the success that we have seen is neither the ball nor the players, but the flag. Soccer or football captures the clan, by that I mean the football club, the temple, by that I mean the stadium, and war. War, not literally, but war in the sense of competition, where the enemy is the club of another neighborhood or another city or another country. And there's a fourth ingredient, which is eternity in some sense, which is a t-shirt, a t-shirt that identifies you, a t-shirt whose tradition is passed from generation to generation. I think we can safely say that in soccer, you never walk alone. Well, I think it's important, at least from my perspective for this talk, to have these four ingredients in mind of what is the flag. The flag is the clan, the temple, war or competition, and eternity. Okay, I will come back to this point soon. That was my first point. The second is about what has been called in the media the new breed of owners, in particular, the new breed of American owners. It's not only really American, but mainly American, I would think. So let me talk a little bit about these people. First, personally, I'm not sure what that term means, the term new breed. I'm thinking about the owners of Manchester United, Arsenal, Aston Villa, Fulham in London, or about the current American owners of Liverpool versus the previous American owners of Liverpool. They are really different. They are very heterogeneous in what they do, how they approach the business in football. I think there is a large variety of owners, and it is not easy to generalize into a single term called new breed. They have many things in common, and other things that make them very different. What they do have in common, in my opinion, is that they bring resources into the football industry, which is good. And also that they are typically coming from being successful in other industries, which means that they may bring more efficient practices and greater professionalism. However, I don't think that they are finding it easy to transport their success or the successes from more efficient practices in previous industries into the football industry. It's difficult. Also, some of these owners engage directly with football, others are not very interested. Some of them have a willingness to learn and to understand and not to be complacent, but others not so much. And as we have seen in the Super League, even some of the owners with the right attitudes make mistakes, important mistakes. I think football is definitely not an easy business. In terms of differences, I've been thinking, how would I characterize this type of owners? I think the simplified way to characterize them is that there are probably around essentially two types. On the one hand, we have learners and adapters. And on the other, inefficient and non-adapters. For these inefficient and non-adapters, experience in football is really mostly a waste of resources, just a consumption good. Among the first ones, the more interesting ones, the learners and the adapters, the ones that appear to be more successful are those that are really willing to engage and not to be distracted by their own egos. They treat it seriously. They don't treat football as a toy or as a pastime. Of course, what I'm saying not only applies to American owners, but also to owners coming from Saudi Arabia, China, Russia, not only in the Premier League, but in other leagues in Europe as well. Overall, I think that this type of owners, learners and adapters, are good news for professional football, except perhaps that they bring their own biases, their own cultural biases, I would say. In some sense, they have to learn to overcome these biases if they want to be successful. As I said, I have in mind several American owners and a very important and specific bias. Let me explain. The US, as everybody knows, is a country with closed leagues. In all the major professional sports, they have the NBA, the NFL, the Major League Baseball, the Major League Soccer, the NHL in hockey, etc. So these owners grew up not seeing anything wrong with this type of leagues. So, as such, I don't think we should be surprised to see that many would appear, and they are, supporting a move towards having similar closed or semi-closed leagues in European football. I remember I wrote, it must have been in December, a very small piece for a US magazine where I noted that, in my view, moving to a closed league, that was the discussion then, would be a major mistake. Perhaps not in the short run, but definitely in the medium and long run. Well, in retrospect, I think I have to say I was wrong. It seems that even in the short run is a bad idea, at least with the format that the Super League has proposed last month. I was thinking it would be wrong in the medium and long run because of the last point I would make today, but I will tell you about this in a minute. With respect to the short run, it turns out, in retrospect, that the flag, this identity of how we conduct ourselves, how we compete against each other, not in closed but in open competitions with promotion and relegation, is in fact much stronger than expected. I think that's exactly the reason why I got it wrong, that even in the short run, these type of competitions are essential, an essential component, truly essential. They have been an essential component of the culture of European football, not only in Europe, also in other countries, and is a key, in my opinion, a key determinant of what has made football so successful and what it means to people. Not to mention the elitism associated with the type of closed leagues that they were proposing, very elitist. So most people do not like, I think, a weakening of the traditional national leagues and the city rivalries within the same nation, which is exactly what the Super League would do or would have done. Okay, so in the ingredients of the war competition that I told you about earlier, the enemy, who is the enemy? The enemy is the club of another neighborhood or another city, typically in the same country. So I remember a demonstration against the Super League of the Chelsea fans, actually. It was very funny because there was this one fan who had a poster saying, "We want our cold nights at Stoke in midweek." Okay, so we might definitely like very much to watch Chelsea versus Milan game, but there is really more rivalry between Chelsea in a Chelsea versus Stoke City match or in a Milan versus Fiorentina game in Italy. Okay, so of course when we talk about rivalry versus other countries, not cities in other countries, but other countries, for that we already have the World Cup. My point is about people. It's about people. So if we talk about people, then what about people then? What about their experiences? How are they evolving in recent years? I noted in my first point that soccer or football captures the clan, the football club, the temple, the stadium. The stadium, this is where we get experiences. And now the temple is expanding, and it's expanding fast, to the point that the temple is not really a stadium anymore. It is much bigger than that. So let me expand a little bit on this. First, thanks to the new technologies, we already see a huge increase in the experiences for the regular fan in recent years. Not in the stadium, but outside the stadium, and 24 hours a day, and 7 days a week. And not only my team, but any team. For example, this morning I could immediately get in a few seconds in my phone a great goal by Messi yesterday. Actually, he didn't play yesterday, but that's a different matter. A strange penalty shootout last night in the Europa League final. Or how Harry Kane, this famous forward for England, got injured in practice yesterday and might not be available for the upcoming European Championship. Easy, 10 seconds, my phone. A lot of information, a lot of consumption, a lot of experiences immediately. So most people are indeed having a lot of experiences and will increasingly continue to have access to more and more experiences outside the stadium in the near future. If anything, I think the global game is becoming more and more global. Secondly, in terms of experiences, on-demand access to football is taking new and very interesting forms. So imagine that you are a Liverpool season ticket holder with access to unique content, the under-23 games or the under-18 games, unique videos of training, unique access to in-house press conferences, and similar stuff. Amazon may soon strike a deal with a top club that will look like this very soon. Okay? So very new and interesting forms of having different experiences. And finally, most importantly, while these remote experiences away from the stadium are clearly different from the real life experiences inside the stadium, I think they are very likely complementing each other. They are not substitutes, they are complements, which to us economists is very important. It's a huge, it makes a big difference to whether they are complements or substitutes, and I think they are complementing each other big time. So summing up this second point, I'm fairly certain that the future of the game will look very different from the present of the game. Definitely in terms of experiences for the average person and what these experiences will mean to him. I'm less certain about the role the game will play in people in the future. It is possible that it might move from being a unique social identity good to be more of an individual and social consumption good, with a bit less identity. But we are not there yet, although I sense that we might be moving slowly in this direction. We'll see. And my last point in this introduction is about if this is such an important social good, what do we economists know about social goods? What can we tell about social goods? I did my PhD at the University of Chicago under Nobel laureate Gary Becker. Gary has a very short and very insightful academic paper on this type of social popular goods. It was published in 1991 in a famous journal in economics called the Journal of Political Economy. The title, if I remember correctly, is something like A Note on Restaurant Pricing and Other Example of Social Influences. Okay, that article, what tries to do is to explain why many successful restaurants, plays, or sporting events, etc., similar type of goods, very popular, do not raise prices, even when there is persistent excess demand. The reason is that for this type of popular goods, demand of an individual is positively related to the quantities demanded by other individuals, by other people. So this can explain that type of assumption, which tends to be true in the data, can explain not only the past about prices, why don't we raise prices, but also why the demand for these goods is often fickle, why it is much easier actually to go from being in to being out than from being out to being in. And more importantly, perhaps for today's conversation, why supply does not have to increase to reduce the excess demand. It might be optimal not to increase supply. Okay, so actually Becker starts with an example from a popular seafood restaurant in Palo Alto. This restaurant, Palo Alto, California, near Stanford University. Okay, so this restaurant doesn't take reservations and every day has long queues for tables. Almost directly across the street, there is another seafood restaurant. Similar food, similar prices, similar service. Yet, this restaurant has many empty seats most of the time. So the key question for an economist is, why doesn't the popular restaurant raise prices? Why doesn't the popular restaurant increase capacity and produce more and more? Well, I think the same argument can be applied to successful Broadway theaters, London plays, or opera in Zurich, or sporting events. I don't. This is probably not the right time, the right place to talk, to get into detail about this paper, but just to give you the essence of the argument, with social goods, where the demand by a given individual is positively related to the quantities demanded by other individuals, something funny happens. Demand is not always downward sloping. Demand could have a portion that is actually upward sloping. So that means that for a popular social good, and top football is a very popular social good, indeed, not only top football, but top European football, for which there is excess demand, it might be optimal neither to increase prices nor to increase quantities too much. That is, it might be optimal not to produce more and more games, or at least to be very careful about that. When I say it might, that's exactly what I mean. I mean it might, because we don't know. We will need to implement a very careful study of both the demand and the supply functions to know exactly how much room there is to do so in European football. So, judging by the drastic reactions around the Super League, I'm inclined to think that there is not much room. But this is an empirical question. I don't know yet. It's something that needs to be studied very carefully. Soccer has been very, very successful, tremendously successful in the past century. In the last 50, 70 years, it's been incredible, really. It must have done many things right, which perhaps suggests it's close to optimal. Well, just wrapping up, the points I'm attempting to make in this introduction is they all go in the same direction. First, the flag is critical. What is the flag? The clan, the people, the temple, or the expanded temple these days. And the nature and the identity of the competition is also critical. So it's essential to understand this very well. And second and last point is that as a huge social good of a huge magnitude, owners and rulers, that is UEFA and FIFA, should understand well that it could be optimal to have excess demand for this good. It could be optimal to have excess demand for this good. Okay? It could be that this is exactly an essential component of its success. And if that is the case, it could be optimal not to increase quantities too much, not to produce more and more and more games, such as perhaps rumors are that we might move to a World Cup every 2 years instead of 4 years. So it is very important to realize
I'm afraid
that
I'm going to have to. I'm afraid I'm going to have to limit quantity a little bit as well.
Yes.
I'm ration a little bit just to sort of equilibrate the chances.
I think we have to be very careful about these ideas and study them in great detail before moving ahead. So thank you very much, Joachim.
Thank you, Ignacio. On that optimistic and insightful note, I'd like to hand the floor over to Stefan Szymanski and see whether we actually have some disagreement here. Take it away.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much for the invitation. And it's a great pleasure always to share an event with Ignacio, whose work has been so influential in thinking about sports problems. And I have to say, I'm a great admirer. I've always been a great admirer of his work. And I want to talk about a number of things that Ignacio dwelt on, and I think there is actually quite a good scope for disagreement here. So let me start by saying, the first thing to say is I'm a Londoner. I spent almost all of my life living in London. I mean, I think of myself as English. I think of myself as European, and I also think of myself as an economist. And as an economist teaching at the University of Michigan, I try to explain to my students about the nature of sports competitions in Europe, in particular in football, and try and get them to understand the nature and structure of the business. And one thing that was very striking to me when talking to them about the European Super League and the proposal was how strange the whole episode seemed to them. It didn't really make any sense. And even after I'd explained all the economics, and they say, "Well, I get the economics," but still their reaction was, "I don't get it." And frankly, I think that's because of cultural differences in the appreciation of sports, and particularly, culturally, I fully understand what happened, but economically, I think there are some issues which are unresolved around this, and which will come back to haunt European football. So I want to start first by touching on the topic that really Ignacio was finishing on, which is talking about demand. The decision to launch a Super League was predicated on the theory that there was huge, unlimited, unmet demand for football competition amongst the top quality clubs and teams and players. JP Morgan was willing to underwrite this allegedly to the tune of $4 billion. And JP Morgan doesn't do that kind of thing unless they have a fairly strong belief that there is an unmet demand. This is something that I actually wrote about 22 years ago with Tom Hohen in a paper on economic policy called The Americanization of European Football, where we also argued that there was unmet demand for top quality competition. Now, Ignacio would have you believe that actually, no, people don't really want more of this. It's not really good for us. We shouldn't have any of this. In fact, to put it in the sort of basic economic terms, if you shift the supply curve to the right, you're not going to get an increase in quantity and a reduction in price. That's not going to be the response you get. Somehow demand is going to shift leftwards, and we're going to find ourselves actually wanting less of it and not being so interested. My mother, who left school at 14 and never had any formal training, had 4 children and a limited budget, and she was something of an economist herself, and she would try this out on me when I was a little boy. She'd give us a chocolate from time to time, and after she gave me a bar of chocolate, I'd go back and ask for another one, being a greedy little boy. And she would say, no, that's not really good for you. If you eat a lot of chocolate, it'll put you off for life and you won't enjoy it, and you'll never want any more. And I've had 50 years since then to test this theory. I have free access to chocolate now, and I can confirm that this theory has no basis whatever. I have a bar of chocolate in my fridge right now. I could go and eat it in the next 5 minutes, and in an hour's time, I'd be back for more. The reason I don't constantly eat chocolate all day is not because I am not addicted to chocolate. It's that I realize that there are downsides to my consumption of chocolate, my weight, my cholesterol level, and so on. And that's what holds me back, not the fact that there isn't, if you like, the demand. And that's the nature of top quality football as well. We have a more or less unlimited demand. Now, you might say, well, that's an empirical question. Maybe Ignacio's theory is correct. Well, if that were true, then empirically, we would have seen in the face of continually increasing supply of top quality football over the last 50 years, we have seen some adverse reaction. And we haven't. Because the reason is, in the end, we all want to see the best players come up against each other. And this is what the Super League was offering. It was offering the opportunity for the best teams to meet each other on a regular basis. And Ignacio framed this in terms of clubs. And he is very much personally committed to the notion of supporting the club. But I think a lot of this is really about the players. We want to see the top players playing against each other. The idea of seeing Mbappe playing against Harry Kane or Messi playing against Mo Salah on a regular basis is just a very attractive proposition. And that is exactly what JP Morgan and the clubs thought that they would be able to deliver, and thought that they would be able to deliver at an immense profit. And I think they were right in thinking that. And they will continue to be right in thinking that. And it will continue to be true as long as there is a limitation on the interaction of the biggest clubs operating in different countries. Now, that brings us to a second topic here about this, which also causes immense puzzlement amongst my students here in the US, which is not only was there demand for what they wanted to offer, but also what they were offering offered a way out of what is a fairly major crisis facing football at the moment. So I've written for many years about how football is essentially bankrupt anyway. It's a loss-making proposition. But COVID has accentuated that to a significant degree. Last week, UEFA issued a very instructive report on the financial response to COVID and the state of the clubs in Europe, and it did not make very happy reading. I recommend anybody go read it. You can get it from the UEFA website. But just one sort of simple snippet from that, they pointed out that in the last 15 months, 52 clubs in Europe have gone into insolvency that they had counted. And that's the highest rate of insolvency in Europe for over a decade. We still are at the beginning of the crisis. They're talking about possibly a 5 to 6 billion drop in operating profits. The operating profits last year were reported at 1 billion euros. So if you think about that, these are very large operating losses that are still to come in European football, which could well mean insolvency. Certainly needs the requirement of increased financing, increased borrowing, increased equity injections, and people are going to have to put the money up to do that. What the Super League was offering was a cross subsidy. They were offering to subsidize some of the weaker clubs in order to give them a chance to overcome this financial barrier. Now, you could we could argue about whether this was the most generous proposition or not, and whether the smaller clubs were better off with sticking with UEFA. But the bottom line is that there was scope for negotiating a share of the increased revenues that were promised from the Super League to help navigate the financial crisis. So again, on that level, my students were extremely puzzled to see why this was not welcome. And of course, Ignacio talked on the reason why it wasn't welcome. It's to do with this notion of an open league with promotion and relegation that we have in the European system and the closed system that they have in America. Now, the point, I think, the important point about this is that this is an essentially cultural phenomenon. We love it. And when I say we, I mean Europeans and probably most people in the rest of the world, although I think Europeans are probably more attached to it than most. The British, the English are certainly extremely attached to this, and a large fraction of the protest was really emanating from England. It was much more muted in Spain and Italy, for example. There wasn't that there weren't protests there, but the really intense rejection of this was actually manifested in England. And the fact that this is a cultural phenomenon, I would suggest, is supported by the fact that it's not, if you look at American sports which have closed leagues, that they are in some sense less successful or less attractive to Americans than football is to Europeans. Americans love their baseball, basketball, American football with their closed leagues. They gripe about the owners, but they ultimately they're not yearning for promotion and relegation. When I explain the promotion and relegation system to them in more detail, the most general reaction is it wouldn't work here, which I think is nonsense. I think it would work, but it's just the fact that they don't want it. And what happened with the Super League was the Super League would work as a commercial venture. It's just that European fans predominantly didn't want it. And I think the really interesting question going forward is, how long is that going to last? If the financial crisis deepens for the football clubs, as UEFA is saying it may well do, then will there come a time when there really is no alternative? Or is it the case, perhaps more optimistically, that there will always be business investors stepping forward in order to prop up the clubs, as they always have done, and create this and maintain the network of clubs across Europe, which people feel is so central to their enjoyment of the sport. I think one of the most interesting features of this is, if people think that this has gone away, I think they may be kidding themselves. One of the most interesting developments in the last year or so has been the increasing interest of private equity, a large amount of it coming from the United States. And if we know anything about private equity, it's about getting in, restructuring, turning an unprofitable business profitable, and then getting out. And that, within the promotion relegation system, I would suggest, and all of my research would suggest, that is an untenable proposition. There is no way within the current structure that a systematically private equity investors could pull off that trick. It might be possible at random for one to get lucky and do it, but on average, they will fail in that. And when they fail, what will the reaction be? What will be the economic and political fallout to that failure? So I think we have ahead of us a lot of interesting times, and the issues that have arisen with the Super League are not going away. So I'll leave my introductory comments at that. Thank you.
All right, Stefan, thank you so much. So you had a chance to react to what Ignacio had to say. And what I would like to do is to switch back to Ignacio and see if he has some reaction to what I understand Stefan's hypothesis to be, which is essentially that, there's unmet demand, there's a financial crisis in soccer as it is, and the most natural thing that sooner or later that these two things come together, and that something like the Super League solves the financial problems of soccer clubs as they exist today. Ignacio, do you have a few words of reaction to that?
Yeah, thank you, Joachim, and thank you, Stefan. I think it's very important to understand what happens with social popular goods, that it is optimal to have excess demand. If I wanted a point, that the point will come across this talk is that with those social goods, it is optimal to have some excess demand for this good. How much is an empirical question, but it might be optimal to have unmet demand. And for that, anybody in the audience, I recommend having a look at this 1991 NICE paper on this. Okay, so it's a little bit counterintuitive, but that is a fact that it's optimal to have excess demand. Second, we can go back to the last 50 years. That's perfectly fine. But what is very nice about this, and the supply has been increasing and increasing, what is very nice about this last event is that this is the first time, I think, that we see this adverse reaction, at least as big as it is. Okay, maybe it was some other reaction at the very beginning with the Champions League, etc. But I think it got everybody surprised how big was this adverse reaction. Of course, I agree with Stefan that the cultural reasons why they might be supporting closed versus open is critical. Okay, so it might be optimal to have unmet demand. And the second point is that quantity, we might want to see more often, Neymars and Messi's and everything. But we already are seeing quantity being expanded. So we already see them much more often than 5 years ago, than 10 or like 15, 20 years ago. So thanks to the new technology. So the quantity is already expanding. So these are my two brief comments on what Stefan, and I agree on the rest. So thanks, Stefan.
Okay, so we have a bunch of questions submitted to us by Mentimeter, and I shall try to actively combine some of them. So one question or set of questions refers to the extremely adverse reaction. And some people are asking, how do we understand that the reaction was so much stronger in some parts of Europe, England especially, than in, say, Spain and Italy? And would there be a way to just set it up without the English clubs and just get, to 90% of the value proposition with a more supportive fan base, for example? Is that something that you could envision happening in this fatally flawed project that just has no chance of resuscitation ever, no matter how much money might be on the table?
Go ahead, Stefan.
Right. Okay. So I think it's a very interesting question. I think a couple of things. The idea of a Super League has been around with us for at least 30 years. You can find examples of people recommended this in the 1960s. So it's not exactly a new idea, and it keeps coming back. And one of the things that's happened, particularly, is the transformation of the Champions League from the old European Cup has been it was intended precisely to head off the idea of a Super League by expanding the opportunities for the biggest clubs in Europe to come up against each other in competition. And that's what it's delivered. They play against each other much more often than they once did, even though I would argue there's still unmet demand for more of these competitions. However, the idea of the Super League died down a little in the mid-2000s. And the reason, I think, for that was because the Premier League became so powerful, so economically powerful relative to the other European leagues, that it no longer was clear that the biggest clubs in England wanted to form a Super League. It was quite feasible to see that in some sense, the English Premier League was becoming the Super League, in the sense that I would suggest, and again, not focusing on clubs, but focusing on players. again, what makes the major league competitions in the United States so successful is that they concentrate all of the best players in their sport in the world in one competition. That's the strength. And the Super League would be intended to achieve that, to bring all the best players together. That's the point. And the Premier League has gone a long way towards already doing that. And it increasingly has a large fraction of the world's top players, but it hasn't yet monopolized the world's top players. And that's where the opportunity still lies. However, to address the question, the idea that without the English clubs, the other clubs, big clubs in Europe, could get together and form their own rival Super League, I think is not really credible, because you need the players at Manchester City, Liverpool, Manchester United, and so on, in order to have a credible Super League. So I think that way is without the English clubs, I don't think a Super League is really viable.
Okay, Ignacio, any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Stefan. The interesting and subtle point is that I may be wrong, but I think most supporters perceive that the Super League will weaken the Premier League. And as I said, people care a lot about an Arsenal Stoke City or Middlesbrough versus Arsenal, much more than maybe Manchester United via Real. I don't know. So I think they perceive it, and they perceive it correctly, that it will be weakening the Premier League. Manchester City, Arsenal, Chelsea will be playing the best players in Europe, and just the reserve team maybe in the local home national competition. What I'm not entirely sure about is why was such a big reaction, mainly, and I agree with the question, in England and not in Spain, for instance. Of course, Spain is very different. There is basically two clubs. It's not really the way they split revenues. There are many things that make them very different. Nevertheless, it's a bit of a puzzle. Of course, Real Madrid and Barcelona are not owned by an owner, but they are owned by season ticket holders. So I'm not entirely sure why the reaction was. Of course, there were many more clubs as well in the Super League than the only three clubs, together with Atletico Madrid in the Spanish league. Nevertheless, it's a very open question why the reaction was not big in Spain, at least in my mind. Do you have any gut feelings about this, Stefan?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's surprising, and it's very interesting. I mean, the English fans want fundamental change, and part of what they want is they want actually something like fan-controlled clubs. And what's interesting about that is that the proposal for the Super League came from fan-controlled clubs, allegedly fan-controlled clubs like Real Madrid and Barcelona, and which does also raise interesting questions about how real that fan control is. The other interesting comment to make about this is about the role that Germany played, particularly the decision of Bayern Munich not to join. They pulled out, and again, that is partly to do probably with the nature of the 50+1 rule in Germany, which ensures that the fan membership clubs have control of the football club. And I think to a large extent, there's been building protest in England over many years. And that kind of regulation is what I think quite a lot of fans would like to see. So I think there's a number of political issues built into the reaction to the Super League.
Okay, thank you. Now, one question that's come up, and I'm not sure whether you feel capable of assessing this with any degree of judgment, is the proposed Super League actually legal under European law? Right, so there's many things that the law gets into the labor contracts for soccer players seem very unusual by the labor laws of any country I know. Do you think that there was a risk that this might have actually run foul of regulators? The least worry that anyone should have had.
I can add a thought on this because I have been an expert witness in a number of sports-related cases over the years. So although I don't want to be accused of practicing law without a license, I do have some views on this. So I think actually, there was a Spanish judge issued a decision preventing or intending to prevent UEFA from stopping the Super League from going ahead. So the reverse of the case is not that it couldn't go ahead, but not that the Super League could be stopped, but that the Super League could not be stopped. The question of whether UEFA has and FIFA have a difficult position because in some sense they monopolize the governance of sport. So if they did anything to prevent a new competition from being created, they could face a legal case against them in under European law. I think if for example a Super League were proposed now, but which offered entry on sporting merit, so some form of promotion, relegation, qualification annually, I think there is nothing that UEFA or the governing bodies could do to stop it. That's my opinion.
I agree with Stefan. I think that this issue, and I'm not a legal expert at all, but I think must have been already internalized in JP Morgan or whoever was supplying these funds. Okay, they must have been 100% sure that it was legally okay.
Okay. Another question that came up, which I think is very interesting, is part of the American equilibrium of closed leagues seems to be that there's salary caps, and there's nothing like that in Europe. So is one of the risks or one of the potential consequences of going to an American-style closed shop system that you end up, because of the economic pressures that you already alluded to and the lack of sustainability of the financing model of many clubs, that there will sooner or later be something like a salary cap for soccer players as well?
Stefan is an expert on salary caps and financial fair play regulations, I think. So go ahead, Stefan.
Yeah. So as I mentioned in my opening remarks, European football is a loss-making venture, and it always has been, and I don't think that's ever likely to change. And partly the reason is that it's a hyper-competitive system. Promotion and relegation undermines any incentive to engage in cooperative behavior of the teams. The teams at the top do not want to share revenues or limit expenditures in relation to teams at the bottom because they fear that they might then themselves become teams at the bottom and get relegated. And so what we've seen in America with closed leagues is cooperation to share revenues and enhance profitability. And the American major leagues are hugely profitable ventures. And we've seen limited kinds of economic cooperation amongst the teams, which I would argue is good for consumers. That's actually a good thing. Now, UEFA introduced financial fair play precisely because teams seem to be loss-making. And as I say, I don't think that's a problem, but UEFA did. And so UEFA's financial fair play regulations were intended to try and raise average profitability across the clubs. UEFA claims that they've been successful. I'm not entirely convinced by that argument. It's actually been a few good years because of broadcasting more than anything else. And teams at the underlying level remain in financial difficulty. And this is, the fundamental characteristic of European football, in my view, is the dominance of a small number of clubs at the top, and then a large competitive fringe of clubs that live on the edge of financial failure, who are bailed out by owners who invest not because they expect to make money, but because of the amenity value, the prestige and glory that they obtain through supporting their local football clubs. And this represents an equilibrium that has served European football extremely well for many, many years. And I don't think it's a system that we should do away with, either through regulation of financial fair play or by introducing closed leagues in the American style.
Very good. Ignacio, do you have any views?
No, I think I don't know, I'm not an expert accountant nevertheless, but I think by and far the financial fair play regulation, at least in Spain, they've been very successful. I think something like that might be needed, maybe even a bit more from now on, but we'll see. At least in Spain, that was a kind of a disaster, has improved the situation big time in many, many clubs. Maybe as a result of that, Real Madrid and Barcelona will not longer be as successful as before. But it's a big issue, but I think by and large the financial fair play regulations are a move towards having that type of salary cap, so to speak. You have here at the University of Zurich, Egon Frank, who is a terrific economist, that he does not quite like I don't think, the terms financial fair play regulation. It has nothing to do with financial fair play. It has mainly have to do with solvency, okay? So to make sure that clubs become not as insolvent as before. And I think from that perspective, the FFP have been successful.
Very good. So one other question that came up, and I think this is the last one we're going to take, is one of our listeners or viewers is asking whether the Super League was not actually an attempt to bring in more Asian fans, Asian money, to internationalize what is a very European setup at the moment, and that by having this sort of strong reaction by the fan base in Europe, it's also a fight for the cultural identity of the sport, keeping it like a European game, fully in line with the interests of the fans, at variance with the financial interests of the clubs and maybe the players themselves.
I'm not sure I understand the question, Joachim. I think, like in many things in life, the Cauchy theorem applies. I mean, it's going to be difficult for the resources will gravitate towards the places where they are most productive. So I don't think Chinese money will have an easy time attracting talent, and likewise, I think if there are Asian players that are good, they will gravitate towards having, where they are most useful, which is probably in the main European leagues. But as I said, I'm not entirely sure I understood the question.
Stefan?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question raises what is a very interesting dilemma, that we have again in Europe we have a culturally dominant competition that is globally attractive, and which is tailored to a significant degree for the consumption of European fans. And what should fans outside of Europe, whether they're Asian or South American or North American, what should they do about this? And of course, I think the interesting answer is they should create their own competing leagues. I've always struck me that China now, where football is still probably the most popular sport to watch on TV, there are enough Chinese billionaires to set up a Chinese Super League that could attract many of the best stars from all over the world. And I'm slightly puzzled by President Xi Jinping, who is a famed football fanatic, why he hasn't actually sanctioned such a thing. And perhaps it's he doesn't want to create ripples with the Europeans. But I mean, clearly in the long term, the fact that Europe is globally dominant today should not be taken as a sign that it will always be globally dominant in football. That could change depending on how the different organizations react over the long term.
Fantastic. So I think we're pretty much out of time here. Thank you so much for your insights. And if you have any kind of sort of closing thought or final remark that you'd like to offer as a reflection on this particular stillborn initiative to reorganize, then please share them with us. Ignacio,
I think you have to run another talk soon because there are so many margins and so many interesting angles and so many issues, static and dynamic, and that this 1 hour is not enough. So you should organize one of these again soon.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. Stefan, any closing remarks or thoughts?
Yeah, I do think it represents something of a watershed. The UK government announced an inquiry immediately in the aftermath of this. And I think the European Union will also be thinking about some kind of response in the longer term. So one thing I think they may have done is to they've certainly provoked a demand for government regulation. Whether that government regulation is going to be forthcoming, I think is going to be one of the most interesting political issues in Europe for the next few years.
All right, so thank you both Ignacio and Stefan for many important insights. Thank you to the audience for all the interesting questions you've sent in. So we hope to see you either in the flesh in Zurich at one of our events or at the next webinar, probably sometime in the fall. Thank you.